This is War Map, Russian troops breakthrough in Dnepropetrovsk front. On the Dnepropetrovsk direction, Russian troops, despite the resistance of the AFU, are gradually clearing the pockets left after the winter offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine. Some time ago, the Russian fighters liberated the populated area Dobropasove. This is a very unexpected development of events, as earlier Ukrainian formations regularly sent small groups to demonstrate their presence on a very wide section of the front near the former defense line at the junction of Yegorovka, Verbovoe, Berezovoe. The activity of small groups there still continues to this day. For the past few weeks, the fighters of the Vostok group of troops have been busy searching for and destroying these infiltration groups. At the same time, the movements of the AFU continued to be recorded, including quite deep in the territory conditionally controlled by the armed forces of Russia. There have been no reports of significant changes in the control zones from this section of the front for a long time. However, it was known that the armed forces of Russia were bringing in new forces here to curb the encroachments of the AFU and stabilize the situation. With the liberation of Dobropasove, the armed forces of Russia will be able to stop the actions of small groups of the armed forces of Ukraine on a wide section of the front line. If they manage to restore control over Orestopol and Tikhoy, and then fully re-emerge on the line along the river Volkhya, then we can expect the complete end of such raids by Ukrainian formations. However, this is not the easiest task, and its implementation may not be so relevant given the temporary delays in the publication of footage. According to some data, the armed forces of Russia have already themselves crossed the Volkhya and are operating on its northern bank with small infiltration groups. However, the success of the advance on this section will depend on the organization of a stable supply of the bridgehead and the taking of control of the small sky. Footage from the breakthrough. Fighters of the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade of the Vostok Group took control of a major defense node, including the populated area of Dobropasove in the Dnepropetrovsk region. As a result of prolonged battles, over 400 houses were liberated, and the following were destroyed. More than 2 companies of live forces from the 82nd and 95th Motor Rifle Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 7 armored personnel carriers, 12 anti-tank missile systems, and 25 hexacopters of the Baba Yaga type. The liberation of Dobropasove is an important step for further offensive actions in the northern direction. Systematic approach bears fruit. Units of the South Group of forces are successfully advancing within the borders of Konstantinovka. Small assault groups are gradually clearing out strongholds in the city's built-up areas, expanding the safe zone for supply units. The greatest successes have been recorded in the southern and southwestern outskirts of the settlement. Russian armed forces fighters are already penetrating into high-rise buildings, having reached several sections of Lomonosov Prospect. The outcome of the battles for positions in this area could seriously affect the course of the city's liberation. West of the settlement, assault troops are striving to establish control over the forest strips on the approaches to Dolgaya. This will not only allow them to create conditions for entering the village, but also to secure the supply routes in the vicinity of Ilyanovka from counterattacks. On the eastern flank of the direction, fierce battles are continuing in the southern districts of Chasov Yar and the vicinity of Nikolaevka. The AFU is still maintaining a stable defense in the area, not allowing the Russian armed forces to develop attacks in the northeastern part of Konstantinovka. However, even in such conditions, individual assault groups are able to reach the city, expanding the zone of battles beyond the AFU's front line. Such successes on the Konstantinovka direction have been achieved by the Russian armed forces due to systematic work on the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces' supply facilities. For several weeks, due to increasing losses in equipment, Ukrainian formations have been forced to move exclusively on foot in the vicinity of Druzhkovka. Against this backdrop, the AFU is also increasing the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, but these often fail to reach their targets due to low speed of movement. Hell in Konstantinovka. The Russian army is demolishing the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, storming and taking the city in a pincer. This is reported by Ukrainian militants. Konstantinovka direction. The situation around the city continues to rapidly escalate. The scale of the attacks is such that hardly anyone can now separately identify each position or object hit by enemy aircraft. The Russians are systematically leveling the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine with guided FABs, artillery and drones, trying not just to pressure the front line, but literally to break the entire defense and logistics system within the city's built-up area. At the moment, Russian troops have already established themselves in the areas of Sevenvetrov, Solnechny, and Yuzhny. These extreme quarters are now taking the main hit. Further into the city, the Russian armed forces continue to work with aviation on Central, Decorative, Sputnik, and Belgian. In fact, there is a scheme of pushing the city through the southern and southwestern flank. This was reported earlier. The Russian army is working on the most convenient directions for itself, where it can simultaneously use FPV times barrel artillery times aviation to constantly exhaust the Ukrainian defense. The main problem for the armed forces of Ukraine now is not just the assaults themselves, but the total density of fire. The Russian armed forces are literally bombarding the extreme areas with everything they have. Because of this, any movement for the armed forces of Ukraine becomes very difficult. Reconnaissance is constantly hovering over the city, attack drones are working on fiber optics, and aviation is trying to cut off fortified areas so that there is no opportunity to consolidate. The battles for the city are entering a very difficult phase. In the near future, the extreme micro-districts may partially retreat due to the frenzied pressure of Russian troops. The Russian armed forces are now striving to push the flanks in order to gradually stretch the defense and create conditions for further advancement into the city's built-up area. To put it briefly, it's a real hell there now. Honestly, the city is sinking. Admit the armed forces of Ukraine. Front on the Sel. On the Sumy direction, Russian troops are successfully advancing in the border areas of Ukraine. Assault units are making their way to the river Oleshnya and are also pushing back the AFU and the previously liberated area of Miropolye. Some time ago, the fighters of the North Volunteer Battalion expelled the Ukrainian armed forces from the territory of Zapselye. Battles are still ongoing in the forested areas surrounding the settlement, but the AFU is gradually retreating to the west, trying to organize a new line of defense along the River Sel. The front is gradually approaching the once large logistics center of the Ukrainian armed forces in Bolshaya Rybika, turning it into a frontline settlement. The liberation of the village will allow the Russian armed forces to begin forming a pocket around the larger Mogritsa, but it is too early to talk about its storming yet. Heavy battles are also ongoing in the northern sectors. Russian units are trying to advance on a wide front from Korchakovka to Yunakovka, with the aim of creating a springboard for an offensive to the northeast of the forested areas of Sum. This will allow an increase in the number of drone strikes on the AFU's transport and storage facilities located in the city. It is also quite likely that the approach of the front to the city will cause a new wave of outflow of the civilian population, creating an additional burden on the Ukrainian infrastructure and budget. Out of all the front line, Ukrainian forces are only showing positive results in the section of Zaporizhia. The situation in southern Russia is becoming increasingly threatening. Since early May, Ukrainian formations have significantly increased drone strikes against vehicles transporting various cargo to Kherson and Zaporizhia regions and Crimea. The peninsula faces a threat of shortages of certain goods, and fuel is being sold with restrictions. The threat extends beyond disrupting the resort season in Crimea or shortages of individual products on the peninsula. Strikes against cargo carriers on the peninsula directly impact the combat capabilities of the Russian armed forces on the southern fronts, where the situation is already precarious. On the front line itself, the situation is worsened for Russian line. In the Kamiansk area, the AFU has been attacking for some time and managed to advance on several sectors, pushing back Russian forces. Stepnohorsk and Plavny are nearly lost, as are virtually all territorial gains achieved by the Russian armed forces during the offensive that began in early 2025. There is a risk that the AFU will not only restore the status quo, but will itself begin an offensive along the Kamiansk-Shcherbaki line. Indirect indicators suggest that attention has been drawn to the problems in this sector. However, the situation remains difficult. Ukrainian drone operators have significantly increased activity in strikes against Kamianka, Dnepropetrovsk, Vodyane, and Enerhodar. Local public channels report drone attacks on the city every 20 to 30 minutes, with dozens of strikes. There are casualties and wounded among the local population. Targets also include employees of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, as officially reported by Enterprise Resources. This may indicate the AFU is preparing, if not a full-scale amphibious landing, then a diversionary strike through the reeds at the bottom of the former Kakhovka reservoir. Allowing the loss of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is unacceptable. Eliminating even small AFU groups from there would be an extremely difficult task. Moreover, the Russian armed forces would be severely constrained in strike assets, since the ZNPP is not the kind of facility that should be subjected to airstrikes. Given that Ukrainian formations have already partially paralyzed logistics to southern Russia in the land corridor to Crimea, it is not hard to imagine what will happen if the AFU manages to break through the Russian armed forces' defenses along the Kamiansk-Shcherbaki line. The Russian armed forces will have to transfer reinforcements along the route toward Vasilivka, roads to which are already under frequent AFU strikes. Until next update.